And now I have a pleasure to introduce our invited speaker and my very dear friend, Alistair Knott from New Zealand. So Ali graduated from psychology and philosophy at Oxford University. Then he did his postgrad and postdoc at University of Edinburgh in artificial intelligence. And then he moved to New Zealand where he spent many years at the Otago University in Dunedin and recently moved to Wellington, to Victoria University. And Ali has been active in many areas, in artificial intelligence and cognitive science, but recently also very active in the area of AI ethics and regulation and impact of AI and intelligent technologies on the society. He co-founded the Center for AI and Public Policy, which regularly consults his New Zealand government. And he's also a member of a global partnership on AI within the Responsible AI Working Group, co-leading a project on social media governance, focusing on recommender systems, harmful content, and large language models as well, which is a hot topic today. So I think he's the right person to talk about AI regulation and about how to avoid confusion when we talk about it and when we try to regulate things. So without further ado, Ali, floor yours.
I'll jump into the same seat, the hot seat, which is got the camera on it as well. So hi everyone. So it's really cool to be here. I'm so glad to be invited to talk in such a wonderful place. So how to avoid confusion. So I'm not sure if I will manage to avoid confusion, but like in AI at the moment, there's such an enormous amount going on that it can be confusing. And so I just gave myself that question as a way of kind of like organizing a lecture here. But I first wanted to, not sure. Do I need to? Just, yeah, I think it does. Yeah. So this is a cognitive science conference, and it might be seen as a bit weird to talk about AI regulation or AI oversight in this conference, but I think there's good reasons to do it. Partly because, can you hear? Is this okay? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay, that's good. It's like a press conference now. Actually, it's appropriate, so there should be a press conference. Yeah, pretend you're the press corps. You can ask me questions afterwards. So yeah, so a lot of AI, has its origins in cognitive science research. Like, as you all know, like machine learning, neural networks, vision models, those all originated in, in the work of people who are trying to model the human brain, really. So that may continue to be the case, so embodied cognition and evolutionary computation, the kinds of things that are the focus of this conference, I believe, maybe next in line to be the next big AI developments that end up kind of impacting the world. So I think there's reasons for cognitive science people to be interested in this and to think about it. But also, I guess cognitive science people are well placed to evaluate human impacts. So if you're thinking about the impacts on individuals, that's a psychological question as well. So again, people in psychology or people in cognitive science are well placed to participate in this very broad interdisciplinary discussion, I guess. And I'll talk about sort of my own perspective, because that's what I can bring, I suppose. I've been involved in several things, like Martin already said. So in New Zealand, I've done a few things just at the level of the sort of national regulation or national oversight. And also I've done these things internationally in this global partnership on AI group that Martin mentioned, and in various other groups that I've been involved in. Most recently, some involving the EU. So there's an EU thing that I'll introduce at the end as well. So here's the sort of confusion bit. And this is where there's just so much going on. And you'll know this, like there's stuff in the media everywhere. But there's also people in every government, every country thinking about what to do. And half of the time they're having to upskill themselves. They don't know what AI is. What is this stuff? Like, what is this GPT thing? And then there's various kind of international kind of groups. So there's there's maybe I can use my mouse. Yeah. So countries work together collaboratively, for instance, in the EU, but also more kind of broadly in the OECD, and even more broadly in the UN and UNESCO. There are people thinking about this. So how do they kind of keep the discussions kind of mutually informed by one another? And then there's kind of like, there's situations where countries either singly or in groups collaborate with companies, either singly in groups. And I've had some experience in that around the Christchurch call to eliminate terrorist and violent extremist content online. That's something which New Zealand has played a sort of an interesting role in, and I've sort of been involved in that. But there are other places where people come together voluntarily, and I'm thinking, the big tech companies together with companies, with countries. And then there's the participation of citizens groups and NGOs, for instance, advocating on particular issues in this whole area, things to do with privacy or transparency, or particular takes on extremist content. Those all participate, for instance, in the Christchurch call. And then there's the AI companies themselves, which are generating enormous amounts of money and enormous profits for themselves, and therefore are lobbying everyone and have huge vested interests. So that's happening as well. And then, like I said before, people are writing about this stuff every day in the newspaper. And then the other thing that's happening is that there are advances being made every day or every week in AI. So it's like a hectic, confused space. Do you agree? You can't see, you can't see my titles. I'm not. Can I get rid of this? How can I get rid of this? No, get rid of this. Oh, good. Great. Thank you. Thanks. Yeah. So. Oh, now we need to come back here. Yeah. So how do you organize this conversation basically is what I'm trying to think about in this lecture. How can we set things up and so that the discussion is efficient, so that there's not kind of like overlap or redundancy, and so that things aren't left out, and so that we involve all the people that need to be involved. I suppose that's the issue here. So the way I'm going to try to structure this is, suggesting a kind of answer is, how we can think about organizing this conversation globally so that it involves everyone it needs to, is to sort of separate out national AI governance issues from international ones, because there are some uses of AI that can be really profitably discussed at the level of individual countries, like Slovakia or New Zealand, and then there are other ones. Yeah, and in that one, I think that a good place to start, and that's where I will start, is in thinking about how a government itself uses AI. All government departments use statistical models or predictive models, and we can think about how that can be done. And there's some nice things about that area in particular, because there's this well understood principle of open government. The citizens in a country have a right to know how their government operates. And so they have a right to know about the way the AI systems or the machine learning models or whatever inside government departments work. So you can't ask companies for the same level of transparency or disclosure, but for government uses, you really can. So there's some things which are a lot easier in the domain of government uses of AI. Does that make sense? Are you with me? You understand what I'm saying? Yeah, so a government can also, it's in the position, since it's in charge, it can put its own house in order. If it decides that within its own departments, this needs to happen, it doesn't need to go out to a sort of negotiation with companies or sort of like, it can just say, this is the way it's now going to be, because it's in charge of itself. So it can self-regulate, if you see what I mean. Then there's some other rules for not government use, but just use of AI in companies that can also be decided nationally. So, and I'll talk about those as well. Other uses of AI definitely need to be international in their scope in terms of how you discuss them. And that's because lots of AI services that are delivered on the internet cross national boundaries. The internet doesn't respect international boundaries. And the big tech companies are global. And so all issues to do with how they use AI need to be discussed at this kind of like much larger international level. And there's another thing about big tech companies, which is that their own services and products involve a huge amount of AI. And I'll talk about social media in particular and talk about the AI methods that are used to implement social media platforms. And then there's, I suppose because they use AI so much, they're also at the forefront of AI research. And this is a new thing. Unfortunately, we have to state this. The cutting edge AI research does not happen in academic contexts at the moment. It happens in these enormous multinational companies and the giant teams of experts that are paid huge amounts. And they have, many of the best AI researchers in the world. And so they're also the producers of the cutting edge AI to a large extent. And so the AI that we see as consumers is by a large, in a large degree produced by and disseminated by the big tech companies. And so some parts of regulating AI need to regulate these multinational groups, and that is an international issue. So I'll start off with that first smaller thing, because that's an easy place to start. So part of thinking about how to kind of structure these discussions is that there are certain places where groups can get started, and that's definitely what we thought. We thought we gave ourselves an easy target to start with, rather than tackling multinational AI oversight. Let's just think about AI in New Zealand, for instance, and in particular in the New Zealand government, because of those principles of open government, and because New Zealand government can put its own house in order. So that was our. So the government first wanted to know, well, what is AI? How are we going to define that? What are algorithms? This mysterious stuff. And we had an idea about that, which I want to sort of start with. So our suggestion was you can be kind of restrictive in this in some way, but also it kind of goes quite broad by focusing on machine learning systems that learn an input-output function through supervision. So it's just supervised learning, really, a very basic kind of standard sort of like AI 101 type of thing. And we call them predictive models just to give them a name, but they're just predicting an output from some input by training on large databases of input-output pairs. So this is an interesting kind of category of things, because predictive models, arguably include lots of cutting-edge AI systems. For instance, deep networks. Most deep networks, you can argue they take an input and map onto an output. Most often, they're trained through supervision, so they're predictive models. But at the same time, governments have been using statistical tools like regression models for years and years, since the 50s probably. And those also count as models that are trained from data using supervised methods. So this definition goes broad. It doesn't just look at the latest algorithms. It looks at those in the same category as it also includes much more venerable, older statistical methods. And the interesting thing about that is that both the newer and the older methods have a common set of issues that you need to think about, common set of problems or a common set of things that need to be discussed. And so that's a useful regulatory target. So for instance, all of those models that train on data might have bias in them. They might learn biases if the data is biased. Then there's issues of transparency. Some of these models are more transparent than others. For instance, decision trees, if they're small and nice and transparent, deep networks, not so much. So you need explainable methods to be added. And then there's this interesting issue of human control. If you have a really good AI system that normally is right, like 95% of the time, then the human user who is kind of overseeing that, supposed to be in the loop, can readily just start to learn to trust the system and fall into some weird autopilot mode where they just say, oh yeah, you're right. And they end up being alienated from the decision-making process. And that's something that can occur for all of these technologies. And so all of those problems arise in all of these kinds of systems. So it's a useful kind of category to focus on. But there's another thing as well, which is that all predictive models can be evaluated in the same way. This is what you do with any of your students. When you give them a supervised learning model, you test it by holding out some data that they don't see during training and then seeing how well their system generalizes to that data. So all predictive models, whether they're decision trees or regression models or deep networks, can be evaluated the same way. So this makes a nice level platform, and you can have the same sort of oversight of a model, regardless of what sort it is. So just to summarize, predictive models are a great regulatory target defined that way. And so that was what we told the government. This is your category that you should think about. And what we suggested is our sort of main, well, we had many suggestions for them, but the one I want to focus on is that the New Zealand government should compile a catalogue of predictive models used by its department. We would like to know what are the models of this sort that are used by all the departments. They should be required to disclose that, and along with disclosing them, they should say what their inputs are, what their outputs are, what machine learning method they use, and crucially, they should also give a percentage accuracy, just as a way of starting discussion. So for instance, some used in criminal justice to predict how likely someone is to reoffend, they might be 75% accurate. But that just gives you an idea of what the remaining work is to be done by a human judge. But there might be other ones that are 99% accurate in some other area of, I don't know, health or whatever. We just would like all of those. The data is available, actually. In any country, you can normally get this through principles of open government. But we'd like this information to be gathered in the catalog. And so every year you see what the algorithms are that are being used. And this is part of the citizens' ability to know how their government works, basically. Does this make sense? Yes? Do you like it? Do you like this? No. I don't know. This me being an Old Testament prophet, basically, standing up and haranguing you. It's like church. Actually, it's very much like church. So another thing you can do is, as well as giving percentage accuracy for the whole population, you can also break the population down into interesting groups. For instance, in New Zealand, there's the indigenous group of Maori people, and there's also Pacific immigrants that also make a large proportion of our population, or there could be the group of women or the group of low socioeconomic status people. All of those things can be broken out. And so you can address issues of bias directly by saying, you know, is the accuracy of your system higher on a certain class than another certain class? There's a question from the back. So accuracy is just you're mapping inputs to outputs, and you have a training set that takes you from inputs to outputs that says for this input you should have this output, for this input you should have that output. So you train it up on that, and then you hold out a set of training data and you see how well it performs. You say, you know, how often is it right in its prediction of the output from each input in that test set. So it's a test set accuracy. Yeah. Well, for the task that the government department is using it for instance, predicting reoffending rates of people in the criminal justice system, or predicting the need for some health system to be funded publicly, or something like that. There's many different tasks that are used by different departments, and they use AI systems to help with those tasks. And this is just a way of assessing how well those AI models or those predictive models are doing. So we think that this catalog should be in the public domain, basically. So we thought that this, you know, having a catalog like this would initiate an interesting discussion in New Zealand, because the press would look at it and then they would say, hey, but this one's more accurate than this. So what's actually going on? And actually the results for Maori seem to be different from the result, or the results for women aren't as accurate. So you'd start this interesting discussion, and there would be an ability for people to see what was going on and to interrogate the processes. And it would also be a drive for improving performance, basically, in these areas. So the government in New Zealand was quite responsive to this. New Zealand's a small country like Slovakia, and you think that in a small country you might be able to do things sort of efficiently and quickly. So in New Zealand, they created this algorithm charter, which essentially was a charter that governed how algorithms of this sort should be used and deployed and built in the New Zealand government departments. And they're in the middle of working on a catalogue of government algorithms, and I hope that they'll do the sorts of things that we're asking for here. So that's an oversight of AI as used by a government in a single country. Now let's sort of broaden out a bit and think about how a single country might regulate commercial uses of AI within its borders. And there are some cases that you can do quite well. So if you think about ordinary companies in a country like in New Zealand, there's ordinary companies, and they often sort of like, you know, purchase software products, and some of those software products involve AI, and the government, you know, in the country can regulate what standards are applied for those products that are used. So you can, you know, encourage good systems and not allow bad ones. So we did Project Otago, which is about AI and jobs, and I'm not going to talk too much about that. That's not the topic for today. This is like this economic question, I guess. Is AI going to cause widespread job losses? And this is something everyone's thinking about right now. And we didn't have an answer to that question. We don't think you can answer. We have to wait and see. But what we can do is to give different scenarios for the government to consider. It could look like this, or it could look like this. So get ready for one of these kind of thing. But on the issue of jobs, there's something else that happens in AI, which is that AI is increasingly, I'm not sure if you know this, being used to administer human jobs in HR, basically. And an area where they see a lot of use, there's a lot of products that are sold to companies which help them process job applications, basically. So you get 1,000 CVs for your jobs that you've advertised, and you need to sort of whittle that number down to a short list or a long list. Often AI does that work. And sometimes AI goes even further and conducts job interviews, like a sort of pre-screening interview with a chatbot type thing. There's all sorts of things that happen in that area, but some of these products are better than others. Some of them control for issues like bias in job selection. Some of them really don't. Some of them help you de-bias your job selection process. And so we're suggesting that you can have standards that require the right sorts of tools to be used and don't permit the wrong sorts of tools to be used by companies. And so now we're moving a tiny bit into the commercial domain. Now I'll talk about the third one, which is the bigger one, and I'll spend the rest of my time on this topic. So AI use by international tech companies. So how can you oversee that sort of like coherently? So my focus, as Martin said, I work a lot in social media governance, and so I've been thinking mostly about the social media platforms, but there are many big tech companies that have these, or some of them have more than one, and so there's a lot to do in this area. So I've done this work in this international grouping of AI people called the Global Partnership for AI. There's maybe 32 countries in there, something like that, and within the Responsible AI Working Group, I'm leading this project on social media governance. So in a social media platform, there's three sorts of AI system that you really need to think about, and they each have very different issues. So I just kind of like put them up. So there's harmful content classifiers. They're just a classifier. You know, it could be a classifier of text or of video or of images. And if you find, harmful, terrorist content or content that advocates, I don't know, self-harm or something like that, you might want to flag it or ban it or take it down or whatever. There's many actions you can do. Then there's recommender algorithms. Recommender algorithms are things that curate the feed that you see on your Facebook stream. How do they choose the item that you're going to see first and second and third and so on? There's that thing. And then there's the new generative AI systems, large language models, foundation models, those sorts of things. So for harmful content classifiers, the key question is, well, who's deciding what counts as harmful content? How is harmful content going to be defined, especially operationally inside an AI system? How are you going to create your training set for harmful content, for instance, of different sorts? For recommender algorithms, it's a slightly different question. It's more to do with the effect of the algorithm on users, and we're thinking especially of the effects of recommender systems. Are there kind of unintended side effects of a recommender system on users' consumption of harmful content, basically? And how would you measure those anyway? So that's a sort of methodological question. It's actually kind of an lots of psychologists would have ideas about how to do that. And for the large language models, foundation models, ChatGPT and so on, the main question there is about AI use by platform users. So if I'm a user of Facebook, I can create some text for me by GPT or something like that, and then I can post it. And I can post it pretending it came from me or pretending it came from a person. So what are companies going to do about that? Do those questions make sense? So let's start off with the harmful content stuff. So harmful content classifiers are certainly necessary. Companies all deploy them. They take lots and lots of content down. You just have to, because there's like monstrously awful content out there that's constantly being posted, and you need to have a filter on this content to make sure that your platform is safe for its users. There's no question you need some form of censorship, and censorship is a sort of scary word, but the key thing is like there are enormous kind of subtle questions that are raised by censorship processes, and we need to know as consumers, as citizens, what censorship is going on inside companies. We want to know more about it. So there's a transparency issue here. And at present, companies don't tell us very much about that. They don't tell us how their classifiers are built and trained. They don't tell us really how well they perform in the way that we would want. For instance, they don't give us percentage accuracy on some unseen held out test data. And I don't know why they don't do that. Maybe it's not good, but I want to know. Just like I want to know it about the government uses of AI, but we can get that information, but we can't get the information from the companies in this case, but we should do. So our suggestion here is that this is the main focus for harmful content classification for us. We think that some of the processes in harmful content classifier construction and use could be brought into a sort of semi-public domain. And we're thinking, just to take a particular focus for this, our focus has been on classifiers for hate speech. And there are a few principles here. One of them is that decisions about harmful content shouldn't be made kind of unilaterally by companies behind closed doors. Why would we have those important decisions made by people who are mainly thinking about money and maximizing their bottom line? Those decisions should really involve some sort of democratic process whereby the people, you know, who are using the system or who are the citizens in a country or whatever should be asked what they think harmful content is. You know, it's just a democratic principle. Here's another thing. Companies don't all use the same definitions. We know that because if you just look at their sort of textual descriptions of harmful content, they're all a bit different. And so there's no inter-comparison. It's not possible to say this company is, you know, that they're all doing something slightly different. And so they're able to sort of say, yeah, this is our own sort of like latitude that we have for making decisions in this area. But why? I mean, harmful content is harmful content. It should be the same definitions for different companies, we think. And here's a final one. Definitions of hate speech should be made by those who are the targets of hate. This is an interesting one. So for instance, if you have experienced hate, for instance, gendered hate as a woman, or ethnically driven hate as an ethnic minority, or any minority that you consider, or any group that is the target of hate, you would like to have their lived experience of the hate that they have received inform the process of defining that category. That's what we think anyway. So we want to bring this into a sort of more democratic realm where people who are relevant, you know, because, for instance, they're the targets of hate, should be consulted in this. And technically, what we think is that the training sets for a harmful content classifier should be constructed outside of companies in some sort of semi-public domain. Obviously, it can't be completely public, because if you had the training set be completely public, then it would be open to adversarial attacks straight away. So the people who are doing this have to have some privacy, but you want to know what the structures are, and there has to be some public oversight of the process. So in more detail, you'd like there to be a group of annotators, you know, from the relevant, how to decide who they should be is a big question, of course. They should be allowed to discuss, they should be free to disagree. In fact, the disagreement point is very interesting. You want definitions of borderline content, which are often, you know, very important in social media platforms, to make use of disagreement. So for instance, if there's some content item where there's a wide disagreement between annotators, you know, from this public annotation about whether it's harmful or not, or how harmful it is, you want to feed that into the concept of what borderline content is. The entropy of the set of annotators, you know, they're basically defining a probability distribution over categories of hateful content. And if they're unconfident, then you want to say that's a borderline item. If the training set's public, there's this final incredible advantage, we think, which is that the training set can be used by all companies. So all companies have to train their classifier on the same training set. And what this means is that the companies have to compete on the quality of their classifiers. So companies compete normally on things to do with, I don't know, financial metrics, you know, basically market share is what they're competing on. They're trying to get as many users as they can. But what you'd like to do is to make use of this kind of capitalist model of competition between companies in the service of the public good. What you'd like is to have them compete on having good detectors of disinformation or hate speech or harmful speech or something like that. And so they can say, my system, my model is better. And so they devote resources to making best classifiers and keeping people safest. So that's what we like. So for all those reasons, we think that the curation of the content set should be a training set for content classifiers should be in the public domain. And actually, there's an interesting thing here. You also make things slightly simple. If you remember, I started off by saying that if you look within a single country, then you simplify the task. You don't have to look internationally. But if you think about something like hate speech, what counts as hate speech in Slovakia is different from what counts as hate speech in New Zealand. It's a completely local issue. Well, I'm not saying altogether, but there are many things. There are many groups in Slovakia that don't exist in New Zealand and vice versa. So at least to some extent, there are regional definitions that are important here. So you want to get people from Slovakia, from the relevant groups, to curate the data set for that group hate speech, and the same in New Zealand, so on. So here's an area where some measure of regional governance of social media platforms could be imagined. So at GPay, we've just started a project that sort of models this kind of public curation of a hate speech data set. We're doing it in India, and the domain is political hate speech, and it's an interesting mixture of Hindi and English. And the thing is to ask Indian people who are implicated in this discussion as groups, to make decisions and to collectively curate a training set in this area, just to model the process. And we're trying to come up with, in particular, sensible definitions of borderline content that sit on a continuum, that allow you to downrank items if they're a little bit borderline or a lot borderline to different degrees. So I'm aware that I'm running out of time a little bit, but I've got two more topics. So social media recommender systems, this is where we started actually. So recommender systems are they're pure AI systems. They're probably the AI systems that are most widely disseminated in the whole world, I think. They curate the user's daily feed. And so, just to be specific, for each user, they monitor that user's behavior, they see what that user's clicking on, they see what the user likes, they learn that, they learn the generalizations, and they give them more of what they think they like. That's what a recommender system does. So there's a potential problem there that any AI person would be able to notice, right? So these systems learn continuously. So they refine their models of each user by learning from subsequent clicks and subsequent engagement. But there's a problem there because users' choices are essentially a function of what the recommender system tells them. They click on the things that they're recommended, more or less, maybe not the top item, but the top 5 or the top 10. They're basically being driven in their engagement behavior by what the recommender system has already given them. And then the subsequent learning that the recommender system does is essentially a self-fulfilling prophecy because it's influenced by its prior learning, right? So this is classic non-IID, right? Anything in machine learning, it would be the same. It's rubbish. It's rubbish. Okay, so you expect there to be this instability in the recommender system's learning. It's going to get driven off in all sorts of weird directions, right? Because it's just refining a model it already has, a kind of preconception it already has. And if you think that, in fact, there are some cognitive biases, so I mentioned that because this is a cognitive science audience. So we know, for instance, that people prefer, just marginally, but a little bit, they prefer to click on things which are false rather than true. They prefer to click on things which have got political emotion, high political emotion, rather than things which are less emotional. They prefer to click on things which are about the political outgroup rather than things about their own group. All of those things, if there's a little tendency like that, which the recommender system learns, then you might be pushed off into areas of political polarization, political extremism. We don't know this yet, but we'd like to know. We'd like to know what's going on. What we know is that social media companies optimize their recommender system for engagement, basically. But we don't know if there are any side effects. If you optimize for engagement, do you also push people in strange directions like that? So if you want to study that, you can be external like us, outside the social media companies, and run studies, like logging people's clicks, that you've gathered in volunteer experiments, or you can do larger studies. There's all sorts of tricks that you can do, but all these external methods have got methodological problems. So it might be sampling biases. Maybe someone who's an incipient extremist is unlikely to participate in your experiment, where they ask you to sort of like, yeah, we're going to stick a click logger on your computer. Would you like that, Mr. Incipient Extremist? Probably not. And there's all sorts of confounding variables. You might find that this group is more extreme than this one, but uses the internet less. But there might be other things which are also involved, so it's hard to have controls. And then if you're trying to simulate, well, that's just a simulation. So there's all sorts of problems. And most importantly, if you're trying to test a hypothesis about causal effects of recommender systems on user attitudes, then the only really way to do that is to intervene in the lives of the users and to change the recommender systems, because otherwise you're just getting correlations. So there's a sack of methodological problems here. But all of those methodological problems go away if you're inside the company. Companies inside, have themselves these privileged ways of studying the effects of their own recommender systems, and they make use of those privileges. The internal studies methodologically are far, far cleaner, far better. For a start, the scale of the experiments are huge. But what they're doing is routinely run studies that intervene in the recommender system experience of their users, and they're A/B tests. So what you do, you choose this random group of users, completely randomly, selected, this other one completely random, and then you give this one recommender system A, and you give this one recommender system B, maybe with different parameters or something like that. So the only difference collectively between these groups is the recommender system that they're seeing. Everything else is controlled for just by the size of the groups. And then you measure the behaviors of those users. And what you're normally interested in doing is seeing which users keep their bums on the seats in front of your thing for the longest. They're interested in engagement, and then they choose the one that's most engaging. But you can also use those exact same experiments. You don't need to do re-experiment. You don't need to run new experiments. You can take those same experiments and analyze the user behaviors for other things to do with harmful content. So that's what we propose to do. So our experience, just one slide on this. So the Christchurch call for eliminating terrorist and violent extremist content was a starting point for us here, because companies were already on board with the idea that they should do that. They all joined the Christchurch call after those atrocious shootings in Christchurch, and there was this very interesting initiative. Companies, unfortunately, the paradigm for the Christchurch calls was that companies would voluntarily participate, and there would be collaborations which were voluntary between companies and governments and citizens groups and so on. So we were trying to sell this. We spent 2 years trying to sell this particular methodology, which would be easy for the companies to do, cheap for the companies to do. We had no buy-in. Well, actually, that's not quite true. We got very close. Actually, we had an arrangement to do this with Twitter, and it was actually published at the Christchurch Call Summit. Many heads of state were there. It was announced by Jacinda Ardern and François Macron. And then Elon Musk took it over and sacked everyone in Twitter who had been working with. All the teams to do with machine ethics and accountability got sacked. And at that point, we just said, okay, we can't do this voluntarily. We have to work with regulation. And so we pivoted, and now we're working with EU regulators under the Digital Services Act, which gives regulators enormous powers to do the kind of experiments that we want. So we hope that we'll be able to pursue those paradigms under the EU's Digital Services Act. So one final thing, and then I'll stop. Generative AI models in social media. So the issue here for companies, just thinking about companies to start with, is how to deal with AI-generated content. So foundation models, that's kind of the generalization over language models, that includes multimedia content too. So foundation models allow users to generate harmful content at an industrial scale. For instance, vast disinformation campaigns can be created by a small number of people just by hitting GPT and asking it to generate, disinformation of this sort of that. Very easy. So what's the company going to do? How can social media companies respond to that? Here's what we think is needed. We think what's needed are reliable ways of detecting content produced by an AI model, generated by an AI model. You'd like to know whether it comes from an AI model or not. So what we really need is some technology. We need a classifier or a detector that says, you give it any piece of content and it says, yes, this is made by an AI model, or no, this is not made by must be made by a human. Right? That's what you'd like. And this is going to help keep the technology safe. So you need technology to help keep technology safe. And actually, I don't want to say this is just true of social media, far from it. We need these detection systems everywhere. We need them in all domains, not just social media. And the reason is that the world is just about to be flooded by AI content. Right? It's going to be everywhere. So as citizens, as consumers of content, we need some way of knowing. I think we have a right to know. It might even be a new human right. We have a right to know what content is produced by a machine and what content is produced by a person. It just seems to be a fundamental importance to us that we can distinguish these things. And that leads to this technical requirement. So what we've suggested, this is our specific proposal, that if you're a company, or actually any organization that develops a state-of-the-art foundation model, then before you're allowed to release it, you should demonstrate a reliable detection mechanism for the content produced by your model. Does that make sense? So we argue that this is technically feasible. Obviously, you can't have a rule that requires companies to do things that's not yet possible, but this detection mechanism is possible, we argue. There are watermarking schemes that are well established for images and are in the process of being established for LLM generated text. And they're okay, they're not bad, and they'll probably get better. But more importantly, there are much simpler and probably more effective schemes using logging of content. So the deal there is that if you're like ChatGPT, if you're OpenAI, you just log every output that ChatGPT generates, and you create this big database of content. And then your detection mechanism can just be a search over that content, right? It's an extremely simple idea. It's just information retrieval queries on your logged outputs. And then you can say, yes, I found one which is sufficiently similar that I say that your text is actually produced by our machine. And if I don't find that, then the negation is failure. And I say, this is not produced by my machine. Makes sense? So we've written a paper presenting that idea. It's had lots of buy-in. There's all sorts of famous people in this global partnership on AI. And the authors on this paper include Yoshua Bengio, who's been very active and he was actually the co-chair of the Responsible AI Working Group in this company. And Stuart Russell was actually on our project and was very happy to jump on board this as well. So and there are other well-known people. So it's had some buy-in from influential AI people. And we're discussing this idea also with EU regulators, this time not for the DSA, but for the AI Act. And there are all sorts of amendments in the process of being discussed for the AI Act around what it should do with foundation models. Because when they devised the AI Act, the EU AI Act, there was no mention of foundation models because ChatGPT hadn't arrived yet in the public consciousness and the regulators' consciousness. But now they're thinking, oh, we need to have these new things in place. And what we're arguing is that those new things should include this detection mechanism. And I think I'll stop there. So there's some time for questions.
Thank you very much, Ali. So at this point, I'm going to turn off the recording and we can freely discuss afterwards.